It's February 2026, Russia's war against Ukraine is in its fourth year, and today we'll take another look at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke and this is BILD Situation Room. We're starting again in the southern Ukrainian region of Zaporizhzhia. We showed there yesterday that there are signs of at least a very limited Ukrainian counteroffensive. Some call it just a counter-push. However, how many vehicles were actually used there by Ukraine and how many were unfortunately also lost by Ukraine? A new Russian video shows this, providing us with a pretty good look at the combat situation there. We see footage here, we'll look at it all on the map in a moment, of at least 4 armored vehicles from Ukraine. They are moving south here along the railway line from Ternuvate heading south, and now we see a crossing right here, and this crossing is kind of the, well, not exactly the front line itself, if you will, but the moment the Russians say, now you're getting too close to us, now you're basically getting too close to our positions we've captured in recent weeks, and now there are direct attacks here. We see the first group of Ukrainian tanks right now, as I said, coming from the north, now driving east here in the direction of the front. As I said, we'll see that on the map in a moment, and now the Russian attacks with various drones. And it's a fact that the Russians have lost part of their communication capabilities in recent days, specifically due to the Starlink shutdown. That's probably also one of the reasons why the Ukrainians attacked here now and simply wanted to exploit this chaos, this communication chaos. Nevertheless, taking everything into account, we still see that it's the Russian fiber optic guided kamikaze drones, which aren't dependent on Starlink, being used against these Ukrainian columns here in Zaporizhzhia, and which also, at least presumably, destroyed some of the Ukrainian armored vehicles, and also some of the Ukrainian soldiers deployed here have been killed. So we see the footage here, typically quite good quality because it is fiber optic. We see that these are armored vehicles being deployed, and then again and again the impacts, and all of this naturally reminds us of the Russian advances in recent weeks. Here too we see these massive cages built around the infantry fighting vehicles as well as the tanks. We also see these metal flowers or metal roses going in all directions here, these sorts of hedgehog-shaped cages that have been installed, and that doesn't seem to help much either, and unfortunately it is once again similar to the Russian vehicles that attack in that way and then still quite often get stopped. Yeah, all in all, footage that shows us that it's extremely costly for Ukraine to move forward. Footage that also shows us, here we see it, that the vehicles were at least immobilized and that the Ukrainian soldiers then try to reach safety here in the next positions. These are then also the positions being attacked by the Russians, so unfortunately quite mirroring in a way what we've seen over the last few weeks, just exactly the other way around. Here the Ukrainians are trying to drive through this death zone, through this 20-kilometer wide corridor, which is just totally drone infested. And here it's the Russians who then consequently have a relatively easy time with the vehicles. We see it's blue skies, the weather's perfect, and the Russians are managing quite well at this point to stop these vehicles. And just how many there are in total we can see in these next shots, because we just saw that there were already at least 6 vehicles that were being deployed. Now we can see 6 more here. This time they are coming from the direction of Vozdvizhivka and crossing over the very same railway facility that we have just seen a moment ago. Now we see it all quite well. Just now the column, I marked it at the very beginning, came from the north here, headed east. Now we have the second column here coming straight from the west, heading east, and is now being attacked by the Russians here accordingly. Nevertheless, we currently assume that the Ukrainians in this counteroffensive managed to bring at least some settlements back under their control. We also have new footage confirming this, specifically from Staroukranka. Right here we see footage from the 225th Assault Battalion, which quite clearly shows us that the Russian soldiers who had occupied Staroukranka in the meantime are indeed being led away. That means these are recordings that were also released yesterday, though they could already be a few days old. So we don't really know for sure whether it is related to the Starlink outage or if it happened just before that. All in all, however, quite clear footage showing the Russian soldiers who had managed to gain a foothold here in Staroukranka, as we will see on the map in a moment, being led away by the Ukrainians and subsequently taken prisoner. This shows us the situation is extremely difficult for the Ukrainians also. Without Starlink, the Russians are able to defend themselves. Individual Russian soldiers, who of course aren't worth much to the Kremlin anyway, are then lost or taken prisoner by the Ukrainians. All in all, however, we have seen that quite a large number of Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed here as well. Let's take a look at that on the map. As I said, we already talked about Ternuvate yesterday, a small town a little bit further north of the action that we are looking at right now. namely Ternivate, seen right up here. We saw that yesterday, so we're back there again now. Under Ukrainian control, just like Peredoshny also came under Ukrainian control yesterday. And the footage we have just been watching, we can take another look at that, was right along this specific railway line. The railway line, you can barely see it, runs along here. That's this relatively light line that's visible right here. And we had seen it, the first Ukrainian convoy or column came from the north, and then it headed off east from here. The second column came from the west and was heading east from here. And we have just seen the footage for one from Staronkranka, which is now back under Ukrainian control once again as of right now. And the footage where another one of the attacks on the armored vehicles took place, we saw that afterwards, namely in Dobripilya. That means we're assuming some of the vehicles managed to get onto this road here, which was actually already pretty much under Russian control. And that at least some of these villages here in the northern part are now back under Ukrainian control. Yes, all footage from the south of Ukraine, as I said, from Zaporizhzhia, where most of the fighting is currently taking place. They're not just fighting there, but also in the northeastern Ukrainian region of Kharkiv. We have several recordings here showing us that the Russians are trying, on the one hand, to expand their so-called buffer zone, specifically this area along the common border, to push the actual border right into Ukraine. And other footage showing us that east of Kupiansk, the Russian advance also continues, occupying new positions there. First of all, we are looking at the footage from the border, specifically from Chuhunivka, and we can see in these clips that it is the Ukrainian side currently clearing this village of Russian troops. We see the Russians have apparently holed up here in this basement. The Ukrainian shows by firing inside, "I'm here now, you can surrender now." And now it looks as if the Russian has signaled to him that he wants to surrender. We can see all of this in the next shots. They just fired inside there. Here's the Russian's rifle now lying right here. He's coming out now and surrendering to the Ukrainian soldier who was just firing shots in there. Now the question is, are there more Russian soldiers hiding in there? Like I said, here's the Russian soldier and behind him the Ukrainian soldier. We had just witnessed how he had taken cover to basically follow along with this surrender right here. The situation is very tense for the Ukrainian soldiers. He looks like he is suspecting more enemies to be hiding inside. From the footage, it does not seem to be the case that there is another Russian hiding there. The one soldier fully surrendered, but the Ukrainian soldier stays alert. The Ukrainian flag is then attached here, right on a combine harvester in Chuhunivka. And it was apparently an attempt by the Russians to expand this buffer zone, but it simply didn't work out in this specific case. Let us take a slightly closer look at all of this as we fly into eastern Ukraine here, and we see that the Russians have already come quite a long way regarding this buffer zone. So we have had Milov under Russian control for quite a few weeks now, and now there is this new Russian attack towards Chuhunivka. At one point, as we see in Russian footage, they'd partially occupied this village, but were then driven back out again. We have just seen it, so Ukraine has not managed to push this so-called zone further to the north. However, we see, if we zoom out a bit now, how important all this is for Russia and Ukraine, because we basically have a situation where the Russians are right here. We'll get to that soon. Near Kupiansk, have already pushed forward quite far. Dozens of kilometers, that's 40 kilometers, we see it up there. They've pushed 40 kilometers in towards Kharkiv. And right now, just try to simply keep on leading this zone further and further up towards the northern side. First, towards that border region there, we see a village under Russian control already inside Ukraine. And all in all, the Russians are, of course, trying to get this entire border area here under their control. Those are the official statements to prevent further Ukrainian offensives inside Russia. However, you can see it when looking down there at Kupiansk. It's really about occupying this region too. And we can also see here in Vovchansk that they're by no means stopping or giving up once they've managed to capture the first town. Vovchansk also used to have 18,000 residents, but rather that they're trying to push as deep as possible, both here at Vovchansk and here at Liptsi. Here too, Russia's trying, we can see it's already pushed about 10-12 kilometers inland. The objective here remains, of course, to conquer the entire region of Kharkiv, and in that specific sense, the Russians see the attempts here in Chuhunivka also as a way to further extend the front within Kharkiv. And we've already seen Kupiansk on the map, and that's where we want to focus more closely now. There's footage from the Ukrainian 14th Brigade showing that this eastern pocket east of the Oskil is under further pressure from the Russians, who have managed to push into the center now. We see the footage from the 14th Brigade here, as I said, during the defense. That was a relatively large Russian attack where they intercepted 2 MTLB armored personnel carriers in total, and here we see the vehicles. 10 or 11 ATVs, so small assault vehicles and another 2 buggies as well. 17 Russians were reportedly killed and 4 wounded, and we now really see here how this attack is being carried out by quite relatively strong units, various vehicles being brought in, and now we also see that the Russians use various buggies. Also here really mostly always very short clips but very intense footage showing us that the first buggy is standing right here and was directly attacked by the Ukrainians. The Russian soldier was severely wounded right there and could no longer continue to fight. The second buggy then stops right next to it, and the Russian just walks past his comrade to bring it to safety here and continue the attack. These are all very short clips, but they show us, here we see it, exactly which roads were used, so where the Russians moved along to keep heading towards Podoli. And here we see footage coming actually from the city center of Podoli. We'll see that from various perspectives shortly. Here again, there are vehicles being hit directly where the Russians die instantly. This means another costly operation for the Russian army, but we also see in the footage that we are indeed dealing with larger buildings. I think you can see it here now. So some of these are 3 or 4 stories high, the large buildings, the big apartment blocks here. The whole thing, of course, completely destroyed and wintry. Nonetheless, you can see this bag on the eastern bank of the Oskil increasingly under threat as Russians shifted focus, as they're no longer making this flanking maneuver, this pincer movement, but are now attacking frontally with all of their might and are trying to reach Kupiansk from the eastern side, which is leading to these massive losses on the one hand on the Russian side, which we obviously have to pixelate, like the MTLBs I mentioned earlier, which were ultimately attacked by the Ukrainians, but that also leads to the fact that the Ukrainians keep losing ground right here in the Kharkiv region. And we also want to take a look at this on the map. We want to see how the Russian army is pushing from the east toward the Oskil in the direction of the river and toward Kupiansk. We've just seen the videos and can pinpoint their location quite accurately. That means we can show exactly how the Russians are moving forward within this area, within this pocket. First of all, it's easy to see marked fairly clearly here on the left-hand side. So this is the Oskil, that's the river they wanted to get to. They had tried it, basically all through last year with this flanking maneuver here towards Kupiansk. That didn't work. And now there's the new attack directly from the east. And we're looking at this. The videos show us that the Russian army coming from the east here moved towards Petropavlivka, then turned south here, and then drove into Podoli here. And looking at this, that's actually about 12-13 kilometers, which are actually still considered Ukrainian controlled on our map here from Deep State Map, our pro-Ukrainian map provider. And it just looks like the situation here is significantly worse than it's being shown on the map. Because this orange area, and this is now quite clear, the orange area is moving right into the center of Podoli. But even more alarming is that the Russians, as we've seen, on these small vehicles, actually quite far through the south of Petropavlovka, almost to Kucherivka, and then here across these large fields between these small towns, we see it here. These large fields, as we just saw, they were able to move. Maps, satellite images show Ukrainian positions all over, so also trench systems. However, these seem to either be no longer manned or the soldiers there simply didn't have the ability to defend themselves in this area. The Russians drove right through this entire area to then attack here in Podoli. We see it, about 5 kilometers away from Kupiansk. And once again, of course, many Russians were killed. We have seen that. However, we also saw some who moved into the houses seeking shelter right in there. So we have to assume that at least some Russians from this larger attack, in which, as already said, 17 were killed, 4 were wounded, that some other Russians managed to gain a foothold here. Next, we're going to look at a really very strange video that the Ukrainian army released yesterday. At first, it looks like it's a drone strike on a tank. We can see that right here quite well indeed. On one side, this typical drone cage with lots of camouflage on top, which we see up here first, that typical angular shape over these large tanks. Secondly, we see these chains hanging down here. We've seen this many times before to ensure that the driver of the tank doesn't get hit. And thirdly, we also see quite clearly, of course, this large gun barrel here, which is the actual main weapon of a tank. And we even see the extra protection down here for the tracks. So all in all, it looks like a tank moving towards us, and a Russian tank at that. But looking closer, it's clear it's not a tank at all. Here we see it much better that we actually have this track protection on both sides as well. So it's meant to look like a tank, but it's not actually a tank. We see it a bit on the first approach, specifically when we suddenly see this big windshield right here. This right here is the big windshield. Right here in front, you can even see the wipers. The whole thing is a small bus, specifically a Bukhanka bus that's been disguised, if you will, There's a tank. That means this little bus pretends it's a big tank. What the Russians were trying to achieve is unclear. Here you see the second approach again. You saw it a bit better just before. So there are no tracks at all. It's got 2 normal axles, 4 wheels, just like a little bus. And we can also see the armor here is minimal. Even with the first drone, there were impacts that basically went through the metal and destroyed the engine right there. The Ukrainians then attacked again. The whole thing is a really strange video where you don't really know, did the Russians want to give them a scare? Did the Ukrainians think, if we look like a tank, then is there some other defense, or is it just another pipe dream they've come up with here? In any case, the whole thing is a tiny bus pretending to be a very tiny tank. In the end, the fate of this vehicle is the same, but of course the Russians still have heavy weapon systems at their disposal, not just tanks, but also multiple rocket launchers from all kinds of different production lines. We have a new video here from the 412th Battalion of the Unmanned Systems Forces, showing us that these multiple rocket launchers remain in use and are being targeted. First, we see an M1991 from North Korea. This one was also destroyed in January by the 412th Battalion here. And then we see more heavy units. The next is a thermobaric rocket launcher or flamethrower, officially called the TOS-1A, which is being attacked by Ukraine, and then more heavy systems. So it means the Russians clearly have a problem with their weaponry, where we're partly seeing many civilian vehicles, lightly armored vehicles, those little vans being used. But of course, on top of that, there is still a steady and constant flow of heavy systems that are coming in. Now we see a BM-21 here that's been attacked. We can also see it from this heat signature. It's clearly just fired off most of its rockets. We can see it here, 1. Out of the 40 wasn't launched, it got stuck in there. And it's now being attacked by the Ukrainians. Another TOS-1 that's being targeted here. Right in a trench system, and all in all, it's simply important to see. We've now reached the end of the 4th year of war, and yet Russia still manages time and again to bring in heavy weapon systems like these long-range weapons or get them to the front line, which, however, in most cases, as these shots show, are engaged and destroyed by Ukraine. All this just shows us how complex this war is. We have drones on one side, we have infantry on the other, but we also still have these classic large-scale systems that Russia is using, which are currently being engaged right here by Ukrainian drones. However, we obviously can't tell if this strike happened right at the start of the operation. In one case just now we saw it very clearly, he'd only just fired off his 40 rockets or 39. In that sense, even these large old weapon systems, mostly from the Cold War era, keep their role in Russia's war against Ukraine. Another aspect of this war remains, of course, the Air Force, and the Ukrainian Air Force has been given very specific tasks, namely tasks that are completely different from what the aircraft actually did in the past. Yes, we have some MiG-29s, for example, which are still carrying out attacks on targets located on the ground. However, we have a decent amount of different aircraft given by the West, namely the F-16 type, which perform completely different tasks than what was actually originally intended, because the F-16S are for the most part being used to defend the Ukrainian airspace, not against aircraft, but rather against drones. And so we have footage here that is truly sensational from an eyewitness, from someone living in a small village, and he's seeing this above him for the first time. What you see again and again, sadly in Ukraine, hundreds of times day and night. It's a Russian Shahed drone. There we see it, a Shahed 136 drone. This typical delta shape is clearly visible here, so it's flying in this direction right over his house. We also see then that the people here are pretty terrified, like that a woman is scared. And now we see, though, at the very last moment that the drone doesn't fly right across simply over this house, but we see that it all of a sudden explodes. First the huge scare, and now we see what it was hit by. Namely, here it is, it's an F-16 from the an F-16 basically provided by the West, which chased the drone here with its onboard cannon, chased the Shahed and then shot it down accordingly before it could reach its potential target, critical infrastructure or residential buildings. We can let that run again for a second because these shots are really intense. They look a bit like Hollywood, that it's actually close combat by pilots, Ukrainian pilots who've only been flying these F-16S for a few months, who are extremely in the fight against Shahed drones and of course also against cruise missiles here, flying extremely difficult and extremely dangerous flight maneuvers to defend the Ukrainian airspace and thus ensure that these drones do not end up hitting their targets. And where the drones are hitting, well, that's becoming clearer and clearer, unfortunately. We have new videos showing us that both civilians and critical infrastructure are being targeted by Shahed drones. Let's start with footage from the night before last here in Odessa. And we can see quite clearly here, that's a large residential tower. So hundreds of people live in here. We even have the lights, which at least we have blackouts in large parts of the country, but the lights that are on, at least in the hallways. And we can see a Russian drone right there that had crashed into the top of this civilian building. There was also 1 death and 4 injuries in Odessa that day, and we'll see in a moment what it all looked like afterwards, showing that there was quite a lot of destruction here right in the streets. These are the residential towers that were hit here. We see purely civilian areas, purely civilian targets, and a large fire on the ground. Apparently a gas line was hit here, or maybe just some vehicles. It's hard to say for sure. It is a very aggressive fire that is raging here. So we see that every single night, major Ukrainian cities, and this city here is located in the southwest of Ukraine, are being attacked by these drones. And that is why the defense that we have just seen is likewise so extremely significant. We want to look at one more video of a drone attack, this time somewhere else entirely, namely in the northeast of Ukraine, in the city of Konotop, in the Sumy region. And here, Russia has attacked a train. This means they are now also trying to stop or at least disrupt the rail traffic in Ukraine by targeting trains that are currently parked on the tracks. Mostly they're just parked there, attacking them with these drones, either with the large Shahed drones or with smaller drones. Over the last few weeks, the Russians used Starlink a lot for that. That is no longer possible because of the current shutdown. However, there are other ways, like using small camera-guided drones to fly directly into these trains. That means we see Russia trying to destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure, but they keep hitting civilians again and again. And Ukraine is just doing everything that they can, using Western fighter jets, for instance, to fend off these drones, this drone terror, every single night and every single day.